My name is Tracy Drummond, and I am here today with Tom Perry, and he is going to be interviewed for the Great Speckled Bird Oral History Project. Just to say it on camera that the interview will be used by researchers. We're going to put the content online. You are under no obligation to answer any questions that you don't feel comfortable with. If you need to take a break, let me know.
Okay.
And a release will be signed at the end of the interview.
Of course.
So let's get started with the first question I always ask, which is, where and when were you born?
Okay, I was born in Lebanon, Pennsylvania in April 27, 1945. That was an accident of Army posting, and my father was in the military, and he did not go overseas, but he was working in various ordnance supply areas, and he was stationed in a military base near Lebanon, PA, and my mother was along in base housing, and that's where I happened to be born. The family has nothing to do with Pennsylvania, though, and everything to do with West Virginia.
Okay.
Okay.
So was your mom working, or was she a housewife?
She had met my father at Concord College in Athens, West Virginia, and her education was interrupted by the war and getting married and then having a baby, me. After the war, she did go on and finish at Concord, and we can talk about that when we get there.
Okay. How long were you in Army? Was your
My
father
father was in the
for a long time?
Army for, I don't know, 3 or 4 years.
Mhm.
He got out somewhere in 45, maybe after peace, and went back to West Virginia, took his Army savings and put them together with his father's savings, and they bought some property, which is the land that I knew, or the part of West Virginia that I knew growing up until I was 10.
Mhm.
Okay. This was near Athens, which is near Princeton, which is near Bluefield. Not coal country itself, but the family's history goes back into the various state counties of West Virginia that were heavily involved in coal operations and coal labor history.
What did your father do?
School teacher. Being a teacher was sort of the Perry family business. Most of his siblings were teachers, taught at one time, or taught the whole career. Large family, I think it was 8 siblings, one of whom died young, who was named after my grandfather, and then I got named after the 2 of them, so I'm actually a Thomas Jefferson Perry III, Roosevelt Democrat kind of family. Yeah.
And did your mother's degree, did she also become a teacher?
She became an elementary school teacher. She didn't teach in West Virginia. She got a job in St. Petersburg, Florida when we moved there. Taught for a few years in elementary school. Went back and got a library science degree so that she could be a school librarian and not have to deal with the young'uns all day long.
But still, it sounds like you had a lot of, there was a focus on education.
There was, very definitely. Very definitely. My grandfather was when my father was born in 1918, he was the supervisor of probably what was a 1 or 2 room school in a mining camp in was Logan County, West Virginia. Place called Chatteroy that you can't even find on a map anymore. But it was a mining camp with the company stores and the company housing and the company school. Yeah.
How did being in a family of teachers and a librarian, how did that affect you growing up?
We read a lot. Education was always valued. Doing well in school was always valued. I'm not sure what else I'd add to that.
Okay. And what was it like growing up in West Virginia? And then for a while you said St. Petersburg and then back.
Well, West Virginia was what I knew for, the first 10 years. We lived on a farm outside of the little town, had about 100 acres. I spent a lot of time wandering in the woods with a dog. I was an only child, but I had grandparents maybe perhaps a half mile down the road whom I spent a huge amount of time with, and some of my father's siblings were still at home when I was a youngster, so there was an Aunt Mona who babysat me, and the youngest brother in the family, Bob, who was a teenager when I was a young kid. So it was quite an overlap in ages there. I had cousins all over the area, whom I saw somewhat regularly. We were pretty poor, but we weren't particularly aware of being poor. The first house that we lived in was a log cabin that was on my grandfather's property, and it had running water because water ran downhill from a creek or from a spring and was piped into the house, but there was no hot water except what you heated on the stove, and toilet was outside. But my parents were frugal and hardworking, and a few years later we built a proper house just up the road on the property that was my father's half of the land they bought. And that had a basement, and it had running water or had well water and central heat and all the other good things you'd expect. So we were better off than a lot of people on the same road that we were on. And it was noticeable we were better off than a lot of the kids I went to grade school with. I remember to this day that some of them I don't think ever saw a dentist until something had to be pulled. You saw kids with tartar on their teeth and so on, and pretty raggedy clothes, but they were good people and I liked them, and they were my friends. And West Virginia felt like a home, felt like where I belonged. And we moved to Florida, and it was like suburban development, and I sort of figured out not to talk like I came from West Virginia and not to talk too much about West Virginia so I could fit in.
What precipitated the move to?
What precipitated the move were two things. One, my mother's health. She had a lot of trouble with the winters, with bronchitis and various respiratory ailments. It was cold and damp. And also just general economic conditions. West Virginia was in the process of mechanizing the mines, and even though my folks didn't work in the mines, That affected the overall economy, which meant less tax revenue to pay school teachers. People leaving the state, which meant fewer teaching jobs. And someone did me the treasure of creating or doing the genealogical research of the Perry family, and traces it back to in the 1780s or so with an Abraham Perry in North Carolina. And you look at the descendants of that man and his wife, and they all, within about 2 generations, all those descendants end up in 2 counties of West Virginia and the 2 counties of Kentucky that were right across the Tug River from that. And it was all coal mining country, but it was also farming country. And then the folks, the Perrys, all stayed there until basically World War II and the aftermath of World War II. I even have some cousins that are Hatfields. If everybody's heard of the Hatfields and McCoys. Well, there were some real people involved in that. And the Blair Mountain Massacre, the Coal Wars, that was where my family, or my Perry side of the family, were living in that time. Don't have any particular stories about the people other than the fact that my grandfather ran the school system in a mining camp for a while.
Was your family generally sympathetic to the plight of the miners?
Yeah.
How did they talk to you about people in your community that were not as well off as you were? Or did they?
Maybe, I don't know that they necessarily did or had to. I do know that where I end up in life has something to do with the fact that if I came home from school with some joke that made fun of some ethnic group and used derogatory language about some people, be they Italian, Polish, Chinese, Japanese, whatever, Jewish, black, I got told, I got told that we didn't do that. We didn't talk that way. So, yeah.
So you had those examples early on. Do you feel that sets you apart from other people in the community?
Some. I do remember 1954 when it was in the news about Brown v. Board of Education, and there was some uproar even in rural West Virginia about the thought that schools might be integrated. And I remember feeling like that was going to be the right thing, the fair thing, and being surprised that that wasn't the way people who were my friends necessarily saw things.
This is making me very emotional. Can you talk? Do you mind talking about?
Sure. We'll get on to something else.
No. I think this
talked
is
about
very
more
important.
often. But yeah, no, we're fine.
How long was it you? I mean, you said you had some very young aunts and uncles, and then you had a lot of cousins.
Mm-hmm.
Was it just your parents, or was it your wider family in general that wouldn't use derogatory language about?
I'm reasonably sure that's true of the Perry side. Because I think some of that has to go back to Granddad. I'm less sure about the Hall side of the family, my mother's side of the family.
Where was your mother's family from?
A little place called Green Sulphur Springs, which is not far from Hinton, which is not far from, I guess it's Beckley, if I remember right. Anyway, it's Bluestone River and New River are not too far away. Hinton was a railroad repair depot kind of town. The railroads played a big role in where people settled in West Virginia.
Did you have much interaction with your mother's side of the family growing up?
Yeah. Summers, I would spend a few weeks, maybe more, with my grandmother and her son. Again, there's a son, Dean, my Uncle Dean, who was a teenager and still at home when I was 7, 8, 9, the year, old enough to remember going to visit. And his older brother, Archie, was in the Army. I remember must have been maybe 52 or 3. Archie brought back a Volkswagen from Germany when nobody had ever seen one around the area.
Did your father continue to teach once you got to Florida?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And how long were y'all there?
Okay, there's 2 answers. I was there till I graduated from high school, and we can get back to that. But my parents stayed in St. Petersburg until my mother died, and my father went into assisted living, and eventually he got to a point where we needed to move him up here, and we moved him up here into assisted living, and then he spent another almost 2 years in a nursing home, and he died, what has it been now, 3 years, 2 years?
Oh, 3.
3 years. He died 3 years ago at 95.
And when you say up here, do you mean the Atlanta area, or do you mean
Oh,
all
I'm
the way
sorry.
up to New York?
New York.
Okay.
New York, Rochester area.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So you stayed. So they lived the rest of their lives.
They lived the
pretty
rest of their
much
lives.
there.
Yep.
And how old were you when you moved to Florida?
10.
So you were really still like coming of age when you got there.
Yep.
And that was a very big difference for you than how you had spent the first part of your life. And you mentioned a little bit about trying to hide your accent when you got
Yep.
there. Can you talk a little bit about that part of trying to fit into a new community?
Well, it was not wanting to be labeled as a hillbilly. And sort of fitting in, and getting to where, say, teachers expected that I was going to be one of the brighter kids in the class. That's what I'd been in West Virginia. We moved to Florida, and it took 6 months to catch up with where kids were there. Maybe a year to catch up. So.
And your father continued to teach once he got there?
Yep. Yeah, he taught until he retired.
And your mom?
My mother she taught. She went to Florida State in the summers to get the master's in library science, and then she switched to being a librarian, and she was that until she retired. Both of them retiring in their 60s.
Um, what was high school like?
High school,
And I mean high school
Okay.
years in general,
In
not
our
just
school
going
years
to
in
school.
general?
Yeah.
my experience of that was colored by the response of the public schools in Florida to Sputnik and the space race. Because seventh grade, they pulled the brighter kids out of the regular class programming and into an accelerated track. And I was with the kids at the junior high school I was at, and then with the same sort of peer group who came from the other junior high that fed into the high school I went to. So, there's a bunch of nerds taking stuff that other people didn't take, and we only saw the folks who were on the other tracks and things like PE and maybe some elective courses, but mostly it was the same 40 or 50 kids were basically my senior class out of 450 who graduated.
So are you saying that Florida, with the advent of the space program and the
Everybody
space
was
race,
trying to play catch up and thinking that we should all be engineers and scientists,
Okay.
and
that was their
response. And their other response was to put us through a Americanism versus communism course that didn't quite have its intended effect.
How so?
It was too obvious that it was one-sided and not at all objective.
Did you find yourself in league with other students who felt the same way?
No, somewhat. I think it was pretty commonly that people, at least people in the group I was part of, felt it was kind of a joke. Yeah.
And what was expected of you after high school?
What was expected? What are you doing, Annie? What was expected after high school was to go be an engineer. Well, that was sort of a track that I settled on myself. In high school, I think instances of public hypocrisy troubled me, or bothered me. But there was no political framework to it. I found it hypocritical what we were doing with regard to Cuba right after the revolution. Maybe I had drunk the Kool-Aid about the romantic revolutionaries and the bad old Batista connected to the mob and so on. So, but then when we're arming people and sending them off to the Bay of Pigs to invade Cuba, when Cuba's had a revolution and has a government, is not doing all bad things, that was troubling and bothered me. But so there were things I didn't like about JFK. Even there were things I didn't like about Johnson. And I found some things interesting in that time period about Barry Goldwater, because Barry Goldwater seemed to be less hypocritical, but this wasn't thinking through what kind of policies and what effect they would have on people. It was more, not the opposite of substance. It was more presentation. So I was interested in sports car racing, so I thought I would go get an engineering degree so I could afford to race sports cars as a hobby. and things like that. And I went off to Georgia Tech. It was very important to me to be independent, so I picked Georgia Tech at least partly because they had a co-op program that you could do from your freshman year. And I picked the Martin Company in Orlando, Florida as the place to be a co-op because it was, some friends of mine were going there.
Can you
Yeah, go ahead. Yes.
explain the co-op
Oh,
concept?
sure. The co-op thing is that you alternate, Tech was on a quarter system now, maybe it still is. You would alternate quarters in class, in school, and then you would go off and work for a company as a co-op. It's like like a paid internship that repeats. So you go work for Georgia Power, or you work for Martin Marietta, or you work for, you name it, school quarter, work quarter, school quarter, work quarter. So you're going year round. There's no summers off, and it stretches out your education to at least 5 years instead of 4. But you can make enough on the work quarters, at least then you could, to pay most of out-of-state tuition at Georgia Tech in 1963. Maybe paid all of it, because I didn't actually take very much money from my parents through all of going to Georgia Tech until the co-op program ended and I had a senior year with no job. So this was like getting work experience with education, and Tech would let me be a co-op as a freshman, and I loved that because I could be relatively financially independent of my parents, and that, for whatever reason, was very important to me at the time, and still is. But, so I end up at Martin Company. Martin Company's a defense plant. And the experience of working there was something that radicalized me. The experience of the civil rights movement going on around me, but not involving me. You know, I'm one of those probably rare people who read the Journal-Constitution. Well, then it was 2 papers. Then the Constitution, we'd get the Constitution in the morning and read it to keep up with what's going on. So I knew some about what was going on and learned more. And did the usual freshman thing of reading all the Ayn Rand books, and decided that she was entirely wrong, and her view of enlightened self-interest was just pure selfishness and not enlightened at all. So, but I was bouncing back and forth between being in Orlando working and being in Georgia Tech, mostly living in the dorms, and then later with some friends living in apartments in Little Five Points, for example. And gradually in that time period, got disillusioned with engineering. Went from aerospace engineering to mechanical engineering because I thought at least I wouldn't have to work in the defense industry with that. And then to applied psych, as I decided I really didn't want to be an engineer at all. I wanted to do something that was more of a helping profession. And I thought maybe I might become a psychologist.
And those classes were also at Tech?
Yeah, they have applied psych there. It's more like experimental psych and human factors, ergonomic design stuff. let's see, a pivotal thing that happened. This is sort of the political education side of your set of questions. There's of course the war going on and the worries over the draft, etc. In 1968, I had finally finished my work quarters with the Martin Company, and I knew they weren't going to hire me back for anything after I graduated. That sort of burned some bridges there with things I had to say about even just their policy on how they dealt with interns, because they didn't give us any sick leave. So now I agitated about that and forced the guy who was coordinating the program to raise it up to his bosses to get a definitive answer that even though we had on paper worked there for more than a year after we'd done 4 quarters, unlike the people in the union who were eligible for paid sick leave, then we weren't, because we were exempt from all that. So anyway, so 68, I needed a summer job, and a friend of mine told me about a summer job that Atlanta Parks Recreation had that was funded by the EOC. And this particular job took unemployed youth off the streets and sent them to Lake Allatoona, to some land the city owned on Lake Allatoona, where the make work part of it was the idea we were going to clear land and create picnic areas and camp areas for a future park. I mean, it was really make work to get guys off the street and let them earn some money and have a different experience. But the staff of it was me and another white tech student and a black tech student who was one of the first to integrate Georgia Tech, and a young black minister, and an elderly white couple who were the nurse and the cook, and a big old guy, good old boy guy who was the camp director. So came time to figure out who were going to be tent mates. This was in tents and no buildings. Who were going to be tent mates, and the young black tech student and I spent the summer getting to know each other and working together.
What was that like? Was that the first time you'd really spent time with
Yep.
someone?
Yep.
Can you talk about that a little?
Yeah, sure. My friend Ricky became an exceptional friend that summer. We spent hours on hours talking and working together and learning from each other. Come the end of the summer, we took a road trip together. My car, the two of us went to California and back by the Grand Canyon. We were gone for about 2 weeks. Interesting experience, in our minds at least, driving through Alabama and Mississippi and Louisiana to get there. We stayed on the main interstates, and we only stopped at the big brand name gas stations. And we breathed a little easier once we finally got in West Texas, although that's not the perfect place, and especially when we got really west, it got more comfortable. Had a car accident in Southern California, And while the car was getting fixed, we stayed a couple of 3 days with his uncle in Los Angeles, in San Fernando Valley. Went and climbed Mount Whitney together, or walked up it. It's not a climb, it's a walk up. Came back, and when we came back, he went back into the issues of being a black student at Georgia Tech, and he was a couple years behind me in his program. And I went back into connecting with political people in Atlanta, some SOC people. You probably heard of SOC in these interviews. Some of the SOC people in Lynn Wells and is it John Simpson? Yeah, David Simpson, who provided some advice and encouragement for us to organize a SOC chapter at Georgia Tech. And I did that.
And for people listening, though, can you
Sure.
tell us, can you spell SOC?
Spell out SOC?
Yeah.
Southern Student Organizing Committee. And yeah, this was white folks who got kicked out of SNCC 3 or 4 years earlier and formed SOC because they didn't seem to quite fit in SDS. Southern exceptionalism, perhaps, but they were some good people. So yeah, we formed a small SOC chapter on the Georgia Tech campus called the Tech Action Committee. Had our meetings off campus at the fairly well-known 16 3rd building house, where a bunch of people who had been foreign students while they were at Tech bought a house, and it became a hangout place for all the people who really didn't fit at Tech. So that's fall of '68. So '68 we did stuff. A bunch of us went to the Nixon counter inaugural in D.C. in January '69. I graduated in spring quarter, well, actually at the end of winter quarter '69. Hung around in Atlanta doing some poorly paid volunteer work for John Sweet, who had a VISTA program of a cooperative or a food co-op that served some of the housing projects. And mostly what John had me doing was coordinating and sort of watching over the student volunteers that John had recruited from Georgia Tech and some other colleges to help with doing the outreach into the community and delivering of food and all that sort of stuff. And then I went off into VISTA myself and did a year in Albuquerque, New Mexico.
Now, we're talking to some of the other bird folks, and actually before I say that, let me back up a little. You said SOC was having their meetings off campus?
Our little tech chapter
Okay.
of the 20 or 30 of us, or 15 or 20 of us, we would meet off campus. There were also, in our connections with what else was going on in Atlanta then, there was, I believe, a newsreel co-op or a newsreel collective in town, and we got films that we arranged to show on campus. You know, like there's a pretty famous newsreel documentary, rather partisan documentary about the occupation of Columbia, the student strike at Columbia University. that was used for organizing work to try and motivate students to get active.
Were tech students generally involved in these kind of activities?
No.
Because I think it's a
Heavens, no.
little. Because I think it's a little more.
We were
conservative.
really a fringe of a fringe. You know.
Were there? What was the environment like when people found out you were doing these kinds of things? Did you have to be protective about them?
Oh, a little bit, but mostly not. We were mostly ignored. We were not really much of a threat to anybody, with the exception that in probably winter of '69, I got called into the Dean of Students' office where the dean had a fatherly talk with me to let me know that I might be careful to what I was getting involved with, and that the FBI had been around asking questions. At that point, I was sufficiently alienated that it was more like a badge of honor than any real threat.
Were you keeping your parents up on your activities at that point?
Not
Or were they
particularly.
aware?
My mother was not happy about a lot of the things I was doing or not doing. Well, she was the one, at least, who would be vocal about such things.
So you had mentioned Vista.
Yeah.
And I've talked to a few people for this project, and Vista volunteering is what got them to Atlanta, but it actually got you out of Atlanta.
Yeah, well, Vista would not let you be a volunteer in your own city. They sent you someplace where you didn't know anybody and didn't know anything.
What was that like?
It felt like kind of a wasted year, in that, well, part of it may have been just the dysfunction of the supervision that we had in Albuquerque, because they really didn't have anything specific in mind for us to do, except for to not get in trouble and not embarrass them, and very little supervision. So what did I do while I was actually there? My roommate and I put together a slideshow of poverty in New Mexico, poverty in Albuquerque, and a talk track to go with it. And I think we found one high school class to take it to, and that was about all that really happened. My roommate and I found someone who was putting together a mimeographed newspaper, which became the Albuquerque Cooperative News Project in honor of the great speckled bird. And we put out a few issues and handed them out. I did a lot of rock climbing and backpacking with some of my friends in Vista who also were kind of at loose ends about what to do on weekends. And New Mexico is a fabulous state. We saw a good bit of it because we really weren't engaged. Now, in hindsight, a lot of that was just I didn't know what I should have been doing. I didn't know about seeking out groups in the community and going and listening to them. I thought we were supposed to have the answers of what to do. Typical white supremacy, liberal sort of thing. So in that way, it was a missed opportunity. And memorable in the final sort of straw in my alienation about things was Kent State, the bombing of Cambodia, the invasion of Cambodia. And there was a student strike at the University of New Mexico that didn't get a whole lot of press. But National Guard got called out there. And while the city police were arresting the students who were occupying their own student union, the people who chose not to be arrested, who were gathering outside, had National Guard troops, gas masks, fixed bayonets, deployed to get in between them and the campus. And the most seriously injured person was a local TV station network cameraman who got bayoneted in the leg. And of course, the commandant of the guard troop, when he was first asked about it, said, well, some people fell into the rose bushes and got scratched. When it turned out to be a news guy, that story had to be changed. I got there just after they'd been deployed because we had heard on the radio that something was going on. We went over to see what was going on. And I was there when the bayonets were still out, the gas masks were still out, and a helicopter with what looked like a machine gun hanging out the door was circling overhead. So I came out of the whole experience feeling pretty disillusioned and angry, and not having anything else to do particularly planned. When I got back to Atlanta, I had heard about the Vincent Ramos Brigade, a group forming, and since I was going back to Atlanta, I applied to join the group.
The Vincent Ramos?
Vincent Ramos Brigade. Okay, if you run into that in these interviews,
I haven't heard.
you will from some others.
You're not, but can I hear about it from you?
Yeah, you can hear about the short version, sure. Came back to Atlanta, and there were 10 or so of us from Atlanta, some of them bird people, some of them just local radical student activists, countercultural people perhaps a little bit. I'd all signed up, and we spent 6 weeks or 2 months doing a little fundraising together and getting to know each other. And that is where I met Ann Jenkins, whom I knew from her byline in The Bird. And we can come back to that at some point if we want. But this group got together and paid their money to get bus rides, or a chartered bus from Atlanta that picked up some people in other cities going up the way to St. John's, New Brunswick, where the Cubans met us with a converted freighter that had bunk space in it for roughly 450 North American youth. I think they were probably all American youth, to go down to Cuba to work in agriculture for 6 weeks, I guess, 6 weeks. And then that was followed with about a 2-week bus tour, and then back on the ship and back to New Brunswick, and then to get back into the U.S. The trips were sent through Canada because if you're a U.S. citizen they can't stop, they could not at that time and can't now stop you from going to Cuba. They can advise you not to do so. They can make it, as it was then, impossible to get directly to Cuba from the U.S. And they could make it difficult for some countries, like I think some people maybe go from Mexico, but that wasn't as easy as going to Canada, because that's an easy border crossing. Back those days, you could get across with a driver's license, and they would have to let you back in if you were a U.S. citizen. So we went to Cuba with 450 of our closest American friends from every possible type of movement in the U.S. There were women's liberation, lesbians, there were Chicano youth, there were folks from the Trotskyists, young socialists. There were people with their roots in the Communist Party, U.S., in the labor movement. Some of those were the most reasonable people we met there, because they wanted to work. That's another story. Gay liberation, you name it.
How long was the trip from New York, or to?
How long's the boat ride?
Yeah, the boat ride.
About a week,
To-
5-6 days, a week.
And what was it like when you got there?
Oh, Cubans welcomed us. They put us on buses and took us. Our particular agricultural work was not done in the sugarcane fields, which was the stereotypical thing that Venceremos Brigade people did. They took us to the Isle of Youth, which on the older maps is marked as being the Isle of Pines. That's that largish island to the south of the Cuban mainland. So they got us there. They moved us into a camp. I don't know what it had been used before we were using it. Maybe it was a work camp. Maybe it was built for us. I don't know. It was like big barracks buildings, but with lots of ventilation, because you're in Cuba. And a dining hall and shower rooms and stuff. And it was situated in a farming area. Then when we worked, we got trucked or trailered to fields, and we, with there was a group leader for each of our little group of maybe 20 people, perhaps in a work group, something small like that. And there was a Cuban leader and a couple of translators, and sometimes there were guest revolutionaries who worked with us for a day or so. People from Laos or Cambodia or Angola or wherever the Cubans had some kind of connection with revolutionary movements. But mostly we went and we fertilized grapefruit trees and we picked lemons, and we probably pruned some stuff badly somewhere. And we'd maybe work what was the equivalent of a 6-hour day and then come back to camp, and sometimes there'd be meetings or educational things. You'd get driven to a little town to maybe see some youth there who were students and hear about the schools and go visit the housing. It was all interesting, and you of course knew that they were careful about where they took you and made sure that you met people who were supportive of the revolution. But on the other hand, most of the Cuban people were supportive of the revolution. So that the problem with the trip really was that there was no organization among the 450 North Americans. And, you know, most of us from Atlanta were probably on the old side of the age group that these people were. And they were thoroughly undisciplined and rowdy, and there were fistfights among people over political issues. Yeah. And some of them who preferred to talk than work would hang out outside the barracks buildings underneath the open windows, and they would talk till 3 in the morning arguing about politics. And if you complained about it, you were being bourgeois. Well, so.
Did that lead to general discontent?
Oh, it reinforced the value of having some leadership and some organization and some discipline.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, if you bring us back to the bird was a real counterexample of that.
This is also making you emotional, which I think is great. Can you talk a little bit about why?
No, I'm not sure.
Okay.
We probably are, if you're ready to talk about what I did around the bird, we can do that.
Well, so you finished with college.
Yeah.
You went out to Vista.
Yeah.
And you came back, and then you went. Who was Vince Ramos?
It was Vince Ramos. Okay.
Yeah, but who was Vince Ramos? Who was he?
Oh, that means we will win in Spanish.
Oh, okay. I thought I was hearing it as a name and not as.
It was the We Will Win Brigade, if you
Okay.
roughly translated it into
Okay.
English.
Okay. But being around Atlanta, you already knew, because this was about.
I knew
late
some of the
69, 70.
people. I knew the bird people by bylines, but didn't know them myself.
Mm-hmm.
I knew the bird as a valued source of information, as as kind of a connection into hearing about what other people were doing. We isolated engineer radicals at Tech. It would be a big deal when the bird was out. You'd have to go find somebody hawking it on the street or somebody who was selling it and get it and bring it back to the apartment and take turns reading it. And there was also a source of information about what was going on in the music scene too, and where there were demonstrations or what was happening. Now, being thoroughly alienated, I also got things like The Guardian and all these hard political publications, and liberal publications, New Republic and The Nation and so on. But the bird was valued because it was local.
And when you got back from Cuba,
Yeah.
did you come right back after that to Atlanta, or?
Yep. Well, some things happened on the trip.
Okay.
Maybe starting on the trip.
On the trip back.
Yeah. Well, on the trip to, actually the preparation before and the trip to, I met Ann Jenkins. I had known of her from her famous story, The Rape of Edible Food. You've probably heard it too. About her undercover reporting at the Pillsbury Bake Off, an expose of it being a shill to sell Pillsbury products instead of out of do good cooking from scratch. So I knew something about her from that story, and we met and got to know each other. Before going.
Before going, okay.
And we became friends, and then in time we became more than friends. And when we came back, we moved in together. And I suppose we date our relationship from when we rented an apartment as Tom and Ann Perry.
When did you get married?
We got married 10 years later,
Okay.
so we could adopt kids in California.
Okay. So I need to back up a little from that.
Okay.
So, did you both go to Cuba?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yep.
You came back.
That made the trip and all the bad behavior and everything else a whole lot more tolerable. Yep.
So you come back to Atlanta.
Mm-hmm. Came back to Atlanta, and Ann went to volunteering or working at the Bird on staff, and I got a job at Georgia Mental Health Institute as a psychiatric aide or a psych tech. And there was a security clearance involved in that, but I guess it only checked probably whether I'd ever been arrested, and I hadn't, so I got a job there. Did that for a few years. Got involved with the bicycling community here
Right.
in Atlanta.
Were you working on the Bird at the same time you were doing that work?
I initially wasn't doing anything for the Bird, except I would get drafted to come help with layout or come help with proofreading. So I learned the skills of cutting in corrections and laying down, doing paste up and that sort of stuff.
Because the Bird had been established and going for a couple of years
Yep.
at that point. What was the culture there? What was it like coming in
Okay, well,
after it was already rolling for a couple of years?
Okay. Because I didn't work on staff and because I had a full-time job, it was a little bit closed, I felt. Now, if I wanted to barge in, I'm sure I could have, but that was sort of what Ann was doing. And, helping out periodically, volunteering seemed to be enough at the time. And I was getting involved in the bicycling side of things.
Around town in general?
With the organization called the Southern Bicycle League, had been around for a couple of years, probably for a couple of years, and actually both of us started going on some of the rides, and I met people in that who were interested in advocacy for bicycling, and also people who had some interest in more competitive aspects of bicycling. So I became active in the Southern Bicycle League, organizing rides, and I started covering transportation issues, specifically starting first about the dangerous situation for bicycle riders in Atlanta. Doing some advocacy there, and I wrote under a pen name of Derailer, which most people did not realize was a play on words for the French name for the gear changer that changes the gears.
Did you write with a pen name because of your full-time job?
Yeah, it was just staying out of trouble. Nobody I was working with needed to know. Although I think anybody I actually worked directly with knew I was doing stuff. But management didn't need to know. Anyway, it just seemed like a fun thing to do. That turned into doing coverage of the proposals for MARTA, the rapid transit, and covering some of the early issues and fights and arguments about where it was going to be and who it was going to help and who it was, was it a good thing, not a good thing. Ann tells me about the editorial meeting where one of the bird people who was there raised strong objections, at least to the fact that MARTA was going to help big construction companies and going to help big real estate developers. And, I think that my position and the position sort of carried the day was a yes and. Yes, it was going to do all those things, but it was also going to get cars off the road. It was going to help people get to work without having to drive. It was going to help people who couldn't afford to own cars to be able to get around. And it was the right thing to do for Atlanta rather than building more expressways. So, you live here, as it turned out to be a good thing. Yeah, probably a mixed bag, but but better to have it than not.
Right.
And if we'd had more power, maybe it could have been even better.
Well, and one of my questions about that was, and speaking specifically of the bikes, not even talking about MARTA making a safer space for bikes around town. What kind of, were y'all able to do any kind of advocacy or outreach around that?
Okay, we started advocating around that in, it was probably 71 at the earliest, maybe more so 72. And I left here in 74. We both left here in 74. I think we did a reasonable job of raising awareness of the storm sewer grates. And they probably have all been changed by now. But in those early days, 1970, every place you had a storm sewer grate, the slots in the grate were parallel with the direction of travel, and they would extend 18 inches, 2 feet out into the roadway from the curb, and they were wide enough for a 10-speed bicycle tire to fall into the gap. And people got hurt on those because front wheel drops into the thing. You're over the handlebars and injured. And even more so, lots of bicycles got damaged. After the Georgia Mental Health Institute job, I worked at the Bike Inn, which it doesn't exist anymore, but it was a bike shop in Emory Village. And my specialty became swapping out the metal rim that had been damaged by going through a storm sewer grate. It would put a huge dent in the thing, and then it would be trashed. And you'd have to either sell somebody a new wheel or swap out the rim part. And I got real good at doing that, so, and did a whole lot of them. But yeah, we got that raised, I think, reasonably well as an issue. The pushback, of course, was the cost of replacing all that cast iron metalwork. We were also advocating for taking the Morningside Expressway right away and putting bike lane in there, or doing, using some of that and putting in bike lanes other places. By the time we left, the one thing that we got was the first bike route, and it was over in the Highland Avenue, Morningside area, and it was a little, 10 or 12 mile loop using side streets and crossing Ponce de Leon at a traffic light where you could then cross it safely. I think you crossed it twice in order to do this loop. A little ride that was reasonably safe for families and children. In terms of real bike routes and being useful, no, it wasn't useful because it really didn't go anywhere that you'd want to go. It wouldn't get you to work. It wouldn't get you to shopping. But it was a step in the right direction, and it was signed as being a bike route, and they swapped out all the grates on that route. So that was the small victory we got to after a couple of years of hammering on the issue. And a lot more people were riding bikes with each year. So it built, and that's why it's a whole lot different now than it was now, 50 years ago, 45 years ago.
49. No, wait.
No.
40.
74.
40-something.
40-some years ago, 43 years ago, when I left.
Were there responses? Did you get letters to Derailer?
Some, not a whole lot, but some.
And
And some of this advocacy was done in the newsletter of the Southern Bicycle League and getting other kinds of news coverage. There were plenty of bicyclists who cared about these issues who didn't read the Bird, and bike shop support for the ideas. Yeah, a lot of people had interest in it.
generally, was your reporting and writing and editorial about bikes and MARTA and whatever else accepted by the editorial board of the Bird?
Yeah, I think so. I didn't attend those meetings, so when you talk to Ann Perry, she can chime in unless she wants to right now. There were people on the Bird who rode bicycles. There are people on the Bird now who ride bicycles, or who were on the board then who are still riding bicycles and who are a bigger nut about bicycles than I am. You probably talked to the Coffins somewhere along the way. Yeah. I think back then he's probably made fun of me about my bicycles, but now I make fun about his bicycles.
Turnabout is fair
Yeah.
play.
Yeah.
So you were active with the Bird from 70 to 74.
Approximately. I may not have been writing that much. I don't. You'd have to go back and check
Okay.
and see.
Okay.
But in 74, I had gotten involved with bicycle racing and knew people in Alabama and South Georgia and various places who were bicycle racers, and that led to a couple of Auburn professors who owned a bike shop looking for somebody to manage it for them. And I got offered.
Here in Atlanta?
No.
Okay.
And I got offered the job of managing a shop in Auburn, Alabama. And so we moved to Auburn, Alabama. And that was kind of the end of my political work around the bird or around the Atlanta community. And yeah, it's my experience of what happened with the 60s and the movement was that from about mid-70s on, an awful lot of us, me included, went back to normal lives and started worrying about, finding jobs that would let us buy a house or have kids or, and we started writing checks to organizations instead of doing the work ourselves.
Did you feel some guilt about that?
Sure. Always. But it's also, I think, we moved to California, and I looked around for something to get involved with there and didn't find anything in that big sea of stuff. And it wasn't until I retired that I really got back. Well, retired and had several years of looking after grandchildren and changing diapers, and decided it was sort of now or never about getting back to doing something.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Is that pretty recent?
Yeah, the last 3 years.
What kinds of things?
Undoubtedly has something to do. Why a lot of this makes me emotional.
What has?
The guilt and then
Yeah.
finally doing something again.
It's hard work.
Yeah. And I am blessed to have the opportunity to do what I wished I had done in those intervening years, because the time is right now.
You said that to me earlier, that this is it.
Yeah.
Can we go back? I forgot to follow up
Sure.
with a question about MARTA.
Sure.
Maybe that'll
That'll be easy.
be easy. Did you maybe get stronger responses to the MARTA writing that you were doing than to the writing about bicycles?
Yeah, probably so. It was a bigger thing with big bucks and more than just fringe people who are crazy enough to be willing to ride to work in Atlanta traffic. I could just filling this out. We came back from Vince Ramos Brigade. I owned a car. We bought a couple bicycles, and I'm pretty sure this was the spring of '71, we sold the car. And for the next 4+ years, lived in Atlanta and then in Auburn, Alabama, without owning a car. we, we did what we were advocating people to do, and some of it was utility riding, get to work, and a lot of it was bicycle riding with people who were into it for recreational reasons, organizing rides, leading rides, organizing a time trial series. This is where you ride your bike 25 miles against the clock by yourself. People started separately and not allowed to draft on each other, so it's a time trial, not a race. But you record who did the fastest time, and that sort of establishes a pecking order of who would win a championship. We ran a time trial series out in Snellville area before it probably got developed now. That wasn't people who raced, but people who wanted to try and see how good they could ride. Mm-hmm. So we did that sort of stuff. Of course, with no car, we had to get a ride from somebody to go to some of these things. But it was quite a good bicycling community. It was small, but it was very supportive back in those early days.
Is there anything else you want to add about your time at the Bird before you move on to Auburn?
No, I think I stressed the importance of it to the readers, which is where I came into the story first. And my respect for the people who put it out and the way they worked together. And we could say the way they've all stayed friends, or a huge number of them have all stayed friends over all these years. I am jealous a bit that I wasn't on staff and fully part of the experience, because I know that group, this was as meaningful an experience, say, as being a GI in combat with a group, where the friendships that form are the strongest of somebody's life.
There's a core group that are very good at consulting with us when we are reaching out to people.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah.
like a family.
Yep.
So that gets us to Auburn in '75. You said you went to help manage a bike shop.
Yeah.
But you also went back to school while you were
Okay.
there.
I did the bike shop management for a couple of years, and the fellows who owned it weren't getting rich off of it. And the bike boom of 1974 was at least partly driven by the Arab oil boycott and other events. And the business was profitable, but not going to be what they retired on. So they decided to sell it. And that meant I was going to be out of a job. I sort of anticipated that was coming, and decided to go into the family profession. Not a whole lot else I could do with a bachelor's degree in applied psych, with a lot of math and a lot of sciences in my background. So I talked to the folks at Auburn University, and they told me what coursework I needed to get a teaching certificate, and I student taught. And then I managed to get a job at Opelika High School teaching basic math, and did that for 1 year, and possibly would have stayed there for a long time, but Ann will tell you about the job she got in California, and since she had followed me to Auburn, I followed her to Los Angeles. I'm not sure it was an equal deal, but that's what we did. Good, she's laughing at that. Yeah.
So, what was it like being in a class, like teaching in
Oh,
Alabama?
Okay. This was an everything that you don't want to do to new teachers in schools with problems. I got 5 classes that were all basic math. The school was integrated, but my classes were, I can't even remember a white kid in any one of those classes. And these were kids who had failed at math for multiple years before they came to me. And I didn't know what to do with them or how to do it. And by halfway through the year, I knew I was leaving. And, you know, in some respects, I feel a little guilt that we didn't stay and I didn't try harder to figure out what would work. And I didn't raise enough of a stink, or any stink, about, I was so glad to have the job initially, before I found out what the implications were. The stink should have been raised about taking all the classes that the experienced teachers don't want and giving them to the new guy. It was incredibly racist and unfair to those kids. Yeah.
So after that came California.
Yep.
Did you start teaching when you got to California?
No, I looked at what was involved in becoming a teacher there, and for a teaching credential, they wanted another year of school, and fluency in Spanish would have been extremely helpful, and I don't have that at all. And the only jobs available would have been substitute teaching to begin, and part-time. And I didn't want to do that. And so through Ann, I got a job working in a typing job shop, which is the sort of thing you'd probably only find in Southern California, and don't find now maybe, because now the engineers type their own stuff. But back then, manuals and technical specifications and so on were, the typing of them was job shopped out to contractors to do it or private business to do it. So a rough draft would be delivered at the end of the day shift for the engineering companies, the aircraft companies. And there would be an artwork group who did the artwork, and there would be a typing crew who did the typing on IBM Selectrics and on composers. And we would put together for review the revised document for the next morning's engineering review, and you know, it's repeating cycles. The only thing that was really fascinating about that job was Motorola was one of the people who contracted with this company, and they were working on the proposals to get funded the GPS system. So there in 1977, I was reading this crazy ass stuff about these geostationary satellites that would somehow allow you to figure out where you are within 50 feet on anywhere on the planet. And it was interesting and sort of fun. My engineering mind kicked in, and I actually enjoyed proofreading that stuff. I did an awful lot of technical proofreading, and the fact I had math and science, physics background helped a lot to do that. Did that for a couple years, decided it was a dead end, and decided that maybe I could be comfortable with some kinds of engineering work or design work. And actually, at the same time I had decided I was going to go get a master's degree, and the thing I could best leverage was my Georgia Tech applied psychology. I was going to get a master's in human factors psychology. And maybe I was going to use that to work in safety, industrial safety. That was my thinking at the time. But I had the good fortune to, yeah, go ahead.
Can you describe human factor psychology?
Oh, sure. Sometimes people call it ergonomics. It's designing the machine to fit the human instead of vice versa. And a lot of it involves safety, because you're trying to prevent people from making errors. And if they make errors, make it possible to recover from the errors. So when you go down to the big copier machine and you have to clear the paper jam, well, my people and graphic designers figured out how to make that a doable process you can do without training, hopefully. Prompts on the screen, labels on the parts. It may even be language free, because it's a multinational market and all that. So anyway, we're leaping ahead to what I ended up doing. But anyway, I was active in the Sierra Club and doing mountain climbing and stuff, because there's lots of mountains in Southern California and California. And I met a guy through that who was working for a contract research firm that had a contract with the U.S. Bureau of Mines to do underground mining safety and human factors research. And my friend had the grad student who was helping him and carrying the equipment around underground in the mines quit, and he needed someone, and he knew me from mountaineering stuff, and he got me a job for this company on the basis of my Bachelor of Science degree, not even already in a master's degree program, when virtually everybody at this place was PhD or master's at least. So I got my foot in the door there, and I worked for those folks for, 79 till 83. So 4 years I worked for them. The only thing I wouldn't work on was I would not work on any military contracts. Mm. So as long as they had some civilian work, I was there.
And you were down in mines.
And I was down in mines, and I was doing that as a full-time job, and I was also going to school for the master's at Cal State Northridge. And one thing, the other's just luck of the draw and luck of white privilege thing that made all this work was, besides the guy who got me the job, whom I knew from Sierra Club, the academic consultant, the professor consultant on this project, turned out to be one of the human factors professors at Cal State Northridge, and he got to know me as a practitioner before he got me in class, and then he was my thesis professor, And as this work was sort of petering out, he got contacted by a guy who ran contract designers for Xerox. And that guy calls up my professor, looking for somebody. So I got the job. So that got me into Xerox. I worked there as a contractor. I got hired on permanent as a regular employee. And from that job with Perceptronics, the contract research people, in 1978 till I resigned or retired in 2008, I never had to look for a job. They were all handed to me. Because of who I knew. Phenomenal luck. And yeah, I worked hard, but if I put myself in any other position, none of that would have happened. So,
When you were working with that one professor in the mines,
yeah.
did it strike you the great irony that you had to cross, growing up so close to mining country?
Oh, yeah.
Strike
Now,
you- that you had to cross the country?
I got to see the other kind of mines, because these were everything but coal.
Okay.
They call it metal and non-metal,
Okay.
and then there's coal.
Mm-hmm. Are those generally safer than coal mines?
They're generally bigger, but are they safer?
Maybe that wasn't the best way to.
Possibly, because they're bigger and they lend themselves better. Well, and the rock that they're in is often more structurally sound. The thing that characterizes coal mines is the coal seam might be only 3 feet thick, 5 feet thick. So in order to avoid pulling out a lot of non-coal rock, all of the action has to take place, under that low ceiling. The metal mines and non-metal mines I went into tended to be, the roof, that is the ceiling, would be 8-10 feet above you, and the space would be wide, and the rock would be mostly more solid.
Mm-hmm.
But they're dirty and dusty and dangerous, and rock falls off the roof. And there's problems with methane gas and all those other things, we heard about. But not as much as in coal. Coal's got big problems with gas and big problems with flammable dust or explosive dust. And that's less so on the ones that we were into.
And those kinds of mines get the same OSHA regulations that.
The coal mine regulations are different. They have to be different because the dangers are so much more so. Ventilation, for example, you can't have. Well, are they? Yeah, they're different by degree. All mines have the same kind of problems. Stuff can fall on you, or stuff can explode, or you can fall down and hurt yourself, or get hurt by machinery. It's an industrial site. Just happens to be underground.
So did you get married before you started your MS? You said you got married in 80? Or was it 78?
I started the MS before we got married. Wait a minute. Yeah. And I was still working on the contract, on the Perceptronics consulting firm because a whole bunch of those people came to our party, so, yeah. Yeah.
So, and then you worked for Xerox, you said?
Yeah.
Until you retired?
Yeah, involved in there was a move from Southern California to Rochester.
Okay.
We got them to transfer me.
So you wanted the transfer?
I wanted the transfer.
Did
yeah.
you not enjoy California?
No, we spent 18 years discussing when we might be able to leave. And there were some two big historical events that kind of made sure we did do it.
Mm-hmm.
The riot of '93, the Rodney King, LA burning, and that affected all over. Our favorite Ethiopian restaurant burned down, among others. So,
And what was the other event?
the other event was the Northridge earthquake, which shook the hell out of things, scared us, did not do much, well, actually didn't do more than some minor cracks at our house, but, you know, freeway bridge half a mile from us or a mile from us fell down, fortunately with no fatalities. That was on the I-10 going to Santa Monica. Houses that were oriented in the wrong direction relative to the shocks of the earthquake had their chimneys fall down. And houses that were on softer materials, like, you know, on sand dunes out in Venice or Santa Monica, got shook off their foundations and just had to be torn down entirely. Our dentist's office in about an 8-story building was structurally damaged enough that it had to come down entirely, even though it was a steel building. And that was a couple miles from where we live. That was quite an event.
So did it just not, was it just too much worry, or it felt too close or too dangerous?
Yeah, it's the aftershocks, and when's the next one? I don't know, if you never lived where they have earthquakes, there's going to be shocks ahead of the big one, there can be the big one, there can be a big one after that, and then there will be this, for months afterward, there will be more little shocks, medium to little shocks. And after a while, well, you either have to just make a joke out of it and start guessing what the Richter scale rating is and comparing it to others, or you start looking for where the exits are and make sure there's a desk you can crawl under anytime you're in a building. And we wanted to get out of Los Angeles anyway.
And did y'all have a family by then?
Yeah, 2 kids we adopted.
And
They did not like us moving them, but they're still with us in the Rochester area, so I guess.
how old are they?
Anthony is 37, Gary is 33, yeah.
Do you want to talk a little bit about how the Rodney King riots affected you guys?
Oh, sure.
Or
Well,
your community?
You know, we were afraid that those police officers were going to get off when they moved the trial to Simi Valley. And Simi Valley, let's see, what would that be like here? That would be like moving something that had happened here in Atlanta to Cobb County of 30 years ago, or further out, where except maybe Cobb County is probably far more integrated than Simi Valley was. That was a white enclave where lots of retired police officers would live after they had worked in Los Angeles as police officers. They go retire out there. So, I mean, everybody knew in LA itself that these guys were guilty of some of the things they were charged with, maybe all of them. And we knew when the verdict came in that shit was going to hit the fan, and it did. And there were very angry young black folks who took out easy targets who were in the wrong neighborhood. So there were a few, but not that many. You know, there's the Reginald Denny, the truck driver. There were Korean store owners who caught it. And there's a whole backstory about the relationship of, you know, other minority store owners in black community, and price gouging and suspicion of their customers and all that sort of stuff that happens some of the time, some of the places. Enough it becomes a belief. It was kind of amazing how far and wide it spread. You know, and how long it went on. We're talking 2 or 3 days before it began to settle down, and flare-ups here and there. Yeah.
Was your home close to, or your neighborhood impacted directly?
In the sense of being able to stand in your backyard and watch the smoke coming up from it was like a store, kind of the equivalent of a Walmart or a Fedco or a Costco, except it was a Fedco for federal employees, discount store. That got looted and burned, and it was, I don't know, a mile from our house, over the main intersection in a business district. Did anything happen right in our neighborhood? No. And our neighborhood was relatively mixed. Maybe, I don't know, I guess the school kid population was maybe 40% Hispanic. No, maybe 60% Hispanic. 40?
10 black, 10 other.
10 black, 10 other, and the rest white. So, Anglo, yeah.
What neighborhood were you guys in?
This was Culver City.
Okay.
Just down the street from Sony Studios, where they do Wheel of Fortune. But residential,
That's sort of,
lower middle class, sort of
Is it-
upper middle class, lower middle class, mostly lower middle class.
north of Los Angeles proper?
That's closer to the ocean.
Mm.
There's Culver City, and you go out and you get Venice, and Venice has a beach.
Mhm.
Or further to the south, you get Playa del Rey, which obviously is a beach with a playa. And there were some old industrial areas where the Howard Hughes Corporation, Hughes Aircraft had operations and so on, that's now been turned into condos, you know, in the 20 years since we left. But yeah, no, we were close enough that the climate was moderate, and downtown was to the east of us, what, 6 or 8 miles maybe, something like that, and a world away. Yeah.
So, when you asked for the transfer, that happened in the late 80s?
That was in, no, 90.
I'm sorry, late 90s.
We started, I started talking with them probably in 94 after the earthquake sometime, and it took about a year of twisting arms and saying, yes, I will probably leave Xerox if you don't do this. And yes, I know what Xerox, or what Rochester is like. I have been there in all seasons on trips. My wife went to high school there, which is a curious coincidence, but, and if you move me, I will stay. And I did.
So you had that kind of leverage at your job.
Yeah.
What were you doing for them at that point?
I was a user interface designer with a lot of experience. And a lot of experience designing stuff for their production printing products. They're the big copiers and printers that are used for companies to print mailings on, or manuals, or, you know, or some of it was for doing billing statements. Pretty much anything. That'd be high volume, and black and white might be good enough because we didn't do much color printing at the time I was there. We do now. So yeah, and we sold a lot of these things to colleges for their print shops. They do a lot of printing. Libraries sometimes would get them for high volume reproduction stuff, where it has an operator that's trained. So if you run into that around here and it's a Xerox machine, that would be the class of machines we're talking about. You know. So, yeah, I worked for Xerox, user interface design, for the most part, although that field didn't even exist really when I first started with them.
Mm-hmm.
I started working with them on things like jam clearance and message text, where you have a display that's only 20 characters wide, maybe 2 lines of 20 characters, and how do you explain how to do something complicated? Or provide 10 features displayed 2 at a time or 1 at a time in a scrolling display, and you manage to select and be able to undo your select, and all this sort of stuff. Somebody has to design that stuff. It doesn't happen by magic.
Do y'all bring in people
And we
to
would,
do?
yes, we would bring in operators to test, and we would have stuff prototyped and test. Not as much of that as we should, because nobody was willing to pay us enough to do it right. So it was a lot of take something out to the field and then go get people's feedback on it. Go interview people about the current product and what they like and don't like and what should be fixed. A lot of information that way. Yeah. It was good work, and it was useful work, even if it was making Xerox money. And even if it was putting print shops out of business, that was going to happen anyway. You know, your small print shop, mom and pop print shops, are put out of business by the Kinkos and the FedExes. You know, now people do it on their Macintosh and take a PDF down there and print 500 copies. That used to be something that kept a little neighborhood business in business. Yeah. Technology changes. Okay. And that job ended up being where I got my teaching jollies. My specialty, once I talked them into not having me be a manager, was to have me used as the mentor for most of the new hires. They would come work with me for a year, 6 months or a year, and they referred to it as the IDHI boot camp. The IDHI is Industrial Design Human Interface. You know, that was the boot camp I would run.
Was that?
with these young designers, and that was great because I loved working with the young guys and young women, lots of women in the field now. So I could keep current and learn new things. The only thing we haven't talked about is what I'm doing now.
Well, and I was gonna say though, when you moved, you mentioned that your children were not happy that you
Yeah.
ended
I
up
mean,
there.
Well, let's see, one of them on the plane trip, this was Anthony, the older one, and showed him the airplane route map, and he saw where the thing went to get to Rochester,
Mhm.
and then he saw where the Atlantic Ocean was, and he said, "Where's the beach?" There's no beach there. Actually, there is, but it's on Lake Ontario, and it's not worth considering compared to Southern California beaches. But anyway.
Did you still maintain an interest in cycling and hiking and?
Yeah,
things like that?
I've left out my running career in there, which actually was
Oh.
longer than the bicycling stuff. But yeah, I had 35 or more years of being a pretty serious runner. Starting in Alabama in about 74 when I ran the first marathon I'd done. And finally ending, let's see, I was 66. I was 67 when I ran my last race, so that was 5 years ago, almost 6 years ago. So I made it to past 65. So from 30 years of age to 29 years of age to 65 running was my major sport. Lots of marathons, lots of ultra marathons, which are longer than a marathon. Yeah. But the running career ended, the work ended, and changing diapers and teaching people how to get up and down stairs without falling at age 2. That career was highly meaningful, but not enough.
Mm.
So.
And when did you start having grandchildren? About what year?
Well, 2000, what are we talking, 2000, 2000. Your mom died in 2000. Raven was born in 2000, but we didn't have care of her. She's still in our life. Her mother's still in our life. Raven's the child of our son Anthony. Actually, all these grandchildren until there's a remarriage are children of Anthony. But so there was Raven, but we didn't do much. But then there was Camden in 2006. And he was getting close to the end of diapering by the time he was living with us and close enough that I didn't do much of it. But his brother Devlin, a year younger, that's when I became prime diaper changer. Anthony had moved out. Carrie, the mom, was living with us and starting to work on a nursing degree, or still in school. Anyway, started working on a nursing degree. So I got to be an expert on diaper changing for that boy. And then there's a divorce, and Carrie still stays with us after the divorce. And then she meets a Colombian grad student at the U of R, University of Rochester, and at tango lessons, eventually, she comes to us for approval for her to marry him. Actually, I think sort of semi-serious, but sort of joking too. And so we gave our approval. And she's had 2 kids with Arnulfo, who are our grandchildren. Oliver is 5, and Elora is, I guess, approximately 7 months. And Arnulfo and Carrie's 4 children live about 2 minutes walk up the street from us in a house we bought so they could live in it and pay rent on it, so that we wouldn't have to drive 20 minutes every time there needed to be some child care. And so our grandchildren could have the experience of being able to walk down the street to the grandparents, which they do. And there's a combo lock on the door, and the 2 older ones, well, actually the younger of the two older boys, he got it instantly, remembered the code to punch in, and the older one, it took longer. It took him a couple days, but they have sometimes come down when we haven't been home and gotten food out of the refrigerator and gone back home, locking the door behind them. You only know they've been there because something's changed. Yeah. So, but anyway, it wasn't enough. So I had gotten myself at least starting to get involved with the Unitarian Church in Rochester, which Ann had been involved in through the choir since we moved there. And people started advising me. First I looked at what the church was doing in social justice, and it didn't quite seem obvious what I was going to do. But various people encouraged me to look at 2 things that were service-related type jobs. One of them was bicycling, and there's an organization in Rochester called R, the letter, Community Bikes, and that takes donated bikes and fixes them up and gives them away to people who are in need. Could be children, a lot of those, but actually the bigger part is adults who need bicycles for transportation. And it's a large operation with 150 or 180 volunteers. And last year gave away over 2,500 bicycles and did repairs on another 4,000 bicycles. All right, so I'm doing that. Mostly on the repair side, because I like the opportunity to have direct interaction with the people who've got the bike and who need it fixed. And I can learn about them, and I can teach them a little bit, and I can get to know them, and they can thank me, and everybody needs to be thanked. So there was that, and I was also pointed in the direction of a free income tax service that is specifically for people with low income. That's another wonderful example of what you can do with something that's scalable, to have lots of volunteers and multiple sites and lots of volunteer hours. That's also got 150 to 200 volunteers. And in the tax season, we did something like 10,000 family tax returns, which is a lot in a small city like Rochester. And the saving over paid preparers doing the work was about $3 million, estimated to be $3 million. And you meet the damn most interesting people, and you learn about the struggles people have in getting by and the creative things they have to do in forming a family unit to be able to get by. Very few married couples filing jointly. Not very many married couples filing separately, but a whole lot of multiple generation households. And you have to ask nosy questions of these folks to figure out what they're allowed to do under the law and what's going to get them the most money back in earned income tax credits and child tax credits. And sometimes it means you have to talk the daughter who's got a low-paying part-time job into letting her children be the dependents of grandma, who's actually got more earned income and can get more money back to the household. Or talk the 22-year-old son into being a dependent of his mother still, and not taking his individual exemption, letting her have his individual exemption, because it'll be a couple $1,000s more for them as a household. So, yeah, you learn a lot. And all kinds of people, and a lot of immigrant folk. Rochester has a lot of folks who were there as refugees and who are now immigrants or U.S. citizens who came from Eritrea 20 years ago as a child. That sort of thing. Interesting stories. So those are my service jobs.
Have they been rewarding?
Oh yeah. Fourth year now doing the bike thing, and I've done the taxes 3 years, and next year I'll be doing it again and encouraging people to do it. But that's not the whole story. We need to do things that rather than just helping people to navigate an unjust system, doing things to try and change the system. So through the church, I've gotten involved with a group called Rochester Alliance of Communities Transforming Society, or ROCAX. Now what that is that you might have heard of or might not have, it is an affiliate of Gamaliel, which is sort of like a descendant or a modern day version of the Saul Alinsky community organizing thing, where you get faith communities to organize, and you provide training, leadership training for people from these faith communities so that they can then organize their communities to demand more funding for child care, to have a new police accountability police review board, because the one we got is totally toothless and has done nothing, and the police chief can overrule anything it says. This is Rochester. That work those kinds of issues. That where we raise the age. Shamefully, New York State and North Carolina were until New York State finally changed this. Those two states were the last two states that automatically treated teenagers as adults in the court system and put them in adult jails when they might get arrested for something. And of course, folks like us who've got resources, your kid gets arrested, you immediately bail him out, and you make sure he's got a lawyer, but the poor folk, and largely this ends up poor people of color in our area, and in New York State as a whole, in all the cities at least, that means you got kids stuck in jail until their case and dealing with an overworked public defender, and if they're convicted, maybe not going to a youth facility if it's something that looks at all like a violent felony, and no consideration given to the trauma that's in those kids' lives that shapes what they have gotten themselves into. So we were part of raising the age to 18.
And that happened pretty recently, didn't it?
Yes.
Khalif Browder's the famous New York case.
Yeah. Well, you may have hear about it from the New York news media and the New York case, and that was critically important to it. But the barrier to getting it passed was the state Senate, and that's where the Republicans are, and the Republicans actually control the state Senate in New York. So the work that we did, getting a few key Republican senators be supportive to vote in favor, was what pushed it over the finish line, so that the governor would have something to sign. It was strategic targeting of these people up in our area.
Was the group that targeted them, was it largely sort of older white citizens?
Rock Axe is, it's probably about half, well, it depends on what you consider the Catholic churches that are in it, because they've got significant Hispanic populations too. It's an interfaith coalition in Rochester. There are some suburban white churches involved, although not surprisingly not the mainline Protestant ones. Unitarians are involved, and then there's some suburban Catholic churches, and I think there's some Lutheran is mainline too. So there's some Lutherans coming in, and then there's a bunch of evangelical black churches and AME. Well, AME I guess is sort of even. Well, some of them are independent evangelical, and some of them are affiliated with the AME. So it's a mix. It's close enough to being integrated that it's probably one of the more integrated movement things in the area. Yeah. And that's been a meaningful thing to be part of. Yeah.
So
that's where I am now.
That's where you are now?
Yep.
Is there anything that maybe I didn't bring up or go back to that you want to revisit?
I don't think so.
About
I
your
don't think so. I mean,
radicalization or the
I thought this
prayer?
was going to be somewhat short, but it's turned out to be
I don't even know what time.
as long as usual.
It's 10 to 5.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Any closing words or any
Uh,
reflections or?
If you run across John Sweet, let me know
Okay,
where he is.
okay.
And I'm hopeful, actually. I'm going to see some people at the reunion who may know where he is, if he's still in the area and still alive. Hope so. I would like to reconnect with him.
Okay, well, if that's it, then I will thank you
Okay.
for your time and your participation.